Khan. I'm from Joburg, from the Far East, from a little small town called Benoni. I work in Cape Town as a freelance journalist in like arts and music and culture for like the last 12 years. So when I moved here to work at the Argus, the Cape Argus, which is a national newspaper in like arts and like music writing. And I just never left. Even after I stopped working there, I just, something about Cape Town and the atmosphere and the vibe and the place just kind of kept me here, even when I didn't have work or whatever, you know. So I also co-run a collective called Future Nostalgia, which used to, or currently is on pause, but like used to host regular events for music listening with like celebrating records and using vinyl as a medium, but really just as a way for people to gather and explore like different sounds, just a bit left field off from the radio, you know. And yeah, and also just like explore the community of music a little bit more from like a perspective of digging and collecting music, a little bit off from the mainstream, let's say, in that sense, in what is considered like top 40 hit music nowadays. So what I mean is like looking back into our own history, so say like a lot of South African music that came before our time, or a lot of jazz that maybe we only learning about now because we didn't grow up with it, or that the radios are not playing. So I'm really talking about the shift from this Americanized culture that has happened in South Africa, or this westernized culture that we have, that we are products of. So now with the internet and now with collecting records, you kind of like, you don't find always what you want, but you find things and then you like, oh wow, I didn't know about this. And the point is that you learn from others, because my record collection and your record collection will never be the same. So you know, I think that has been a process of learning about music. What I'm trying to say is like, when I started working as a music journalist, I thought, you know, I was young and I thought I knew something about music in South Africa. And the minute I started collecting records, which was years later, I realized I hadn't even like scratched the surface. You know, so I was thrust into the position of arts journalist or arts writer. Later I studied this stuff. I went overseas to study. But you learn by listening. You know, that's really how you learn. And so listening, it always comes back to listening, and also like being open-minded about sounds and doing your research and your homework. Here's the thing about generations, is that we grew up, or I grew up in the time of tapes and the philosophy of cassettes, which is like recording yourself, recording off the radio, this idea of piracy, I guess, that comes very naturally when you're working with tapes and mixtapes and then into CDs. So we never really got to explore records. And by the time that, you know, that has a resurgence, there's really like, okay, like a discovery of like, what was it about the appeal of this? But it wasn't really that. I've been collecting for years because I am a natural nostalgist. The thing with records was that I think a lot of people, but for me especially, I started collecting out of interest from like flea markets and stuff, because the medium was so appealing to me as this old object. So I've started collecting before I had a record player. And when I worked at the Argus, which is funny because you just build up this collection and you can't really listen to the music, but most of the time I think it's stuff you know or have an interest in. So like it was anything from Sound of Music to like Depeche Mode, you know, like things that are easy to find. And when I was at the Argus in 2008, which is when I started, I was like with my first real salary as a person in the world. Like I had finished studying and I was like, with my first salary, which wasn't a big amount, I'm gonna like spoil myself with a turntable or record player. And Mabu at the time, Mabu, I just parked outside Mabu one day and found it in 2008. That's when I like arrived here. And Mabu had this like, it was like a record player built in with cassettes, deck. It was like a whole sound system thing going for like $800. And I was like, this is my present to myself as somebody for the first time working a job, you know, like let's and I absolutely fell in love with it. Like the idea of having it in my room. It was like really a wooden beaten up one. It was nothing fancy. it was just the idea of listening and exploring music, and then the liner notes, and then the artwork. And that was like, let's say 2008, but I've been collecting for much longer before that, but the first player, okay?
Yeah.
And then I left Cape Town, and when I returned, like at the start like of this, I would really pinpoint it to 2013 when the release of Daft Punk's album, I forget which one, but the one that came out around 2012, 2013. The promo for that showed the two of them going, like walking down a pathway to a turntable and putting on their album, and that was like the promo material. And this was at a time when you couldn't find like albums in like mainstream stores like Musica. And I remember in December 2013, Musica started restocking vinyl for the first time since they had taken them off their shelves, you know. So this resurgence was very noticeable because it was happening globally, where it was coming back. In some places it never left. For a lot of people, records had always been around. But I think in South Africa, and like once the CDs and stuff started coming in, like people would speak to me about having junk piles full of records that people just throwing away their collections also. Well, selling them or throwing them away, you know. So a lot of places that step never happened, but here it did. So it definitely felt like a resurgence. And also because I wrote about it at the time, 2013, 2014, I did a few articles that mapped it out a bit, and shops were opening all over Cape Town, but also things like Look and Listen, which were big mega stores for like a long time, were shutting down, you know, because CD sales were just not cutting it anymore. I have spent a large amount of time digging, but also money, because these things have become incredibly expensive now. Looking for South African, not only jazz, but also traditional music, and it seems to be some of the hardest, along with African music, for me it seems to be some of the hardest music to find. And you know, we can get into it later, but what's sad is that globally it's so easy to find. But yeah, Yuma Sakela's Colonial Man is an album I'm just digging right now. So I'm just gonna say, and that for me gave me like this moment of like, what, like wow, like how is this overlooked in a sense, or how did I grow up not knowing about this? How come no one's talked to me about this album? You know, so I can say now what's blowing my mind. Yeah, and I think not to stray away too much, but I've been realizing this whole thing about how colonized we are and how we don't even know it, and how we still continue to be, and how the education system perpetuates it. So it's not, while you can't be blamed, at the same time you have to like really put in a lot of your own work to work yourself out of that. So Multi Market, again, shout out. I was there 2 weeks ago and I found this massive book that you could like kill somebody with, called The Scramble for Africa by Thomas Pickenham. And it was like going for $50. And I was like, when you buy a piece of fiction written from a white perspective, I mean non-fiction, sorry, you don't really know if this is like completely false. You have to take it with a pinch of salt, but you don't know. I knew about the book, but I didn't know that much. But anyways, I bought it, and it's beautiful because it's filled with all kinds of anecdotes about David Livingstone and King Leopold and all these maps. And I was like, wow, man. So now I have to use this as a starting point to start learning about stuff. So the first map in there is this 1876 map of Africa before the colonial powers came through, and also showing the ownership by indigenous land ownership. So it maps out a picture of Africa that we don't even think about, or I don't think even grown adults who are in their 60s and 70s, I don't think the thought comes across your mind unless you really have to, because this is how the system works so well in schools. So then I was like, and then I was just thinking of a song to go with a map, you know. I was like that, or you know, I was just thinking of a song, and I was like, oh, Colonial Man by Yuma Sakela. And then I was like, what do the lyrics say? I know I want to check out the lyrics. And then I Googled it and I couldn't find it. And then I went to the record and I started really reading all the lyrics on the back of that album. And I was like, man, this was 1876 is the map, and 1976 is the record cover. And it's so funny to like map exactly 100 years that they really were artists, you know, for as much as Yuma Sakela is considered very popular artist, there were artists in South Africa or in the continent who were like who were paying attention to this stuff and trying to provide an alternative type of history. Because clearly Bantu education was not providing it, and nor is the current system now providing it. We learn more about the West than we do about our own history, you know? So we don't even know that there's all these monuments in the whole continent of David Livingstone, seen as a hero, like hospitals, schools, churches, because he was a missionary. And I'm like 34 and I'm learning about this stuff now, which isn't anything to be ashamed about, because I think that's something we always feel like we should be more intellectual than we are, or we should know this stuff already, but the information is not there. And so in this time of lockdown and being trapped in your house and kind of using social media as a way to spread that knowledge, because it should be free and it should be everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, and especially if you like really feel seriously about it. So it's funny to come to it through music, because there's a track there about Vasco da Gama, and there's a track about Cecil John Rhodes, which was also timely because his statue was just beheaded last week. And what was funny also, like to add to that, was that the city wants to like clean that statue. So for me again, it shows that South Africa has a long way to go before like, and Cape Town in particular, before realizing what's what really. But I think this is what the lockdown does, and it just gives you a lot of time to think and reflect and also learn if you can. I think there's a lot. I think if we weren't under lockdown, there would have been mass protests and mass statues being pulled down in the whole country, because the whole country is like full of settlers and colonialists and just like oppressors that are like portrayed in the most heroic ways, right? So like South Africa hasn't even started this process of taking down the statues. But I think that because of the lockdown and fear and paranoia, South Africa just didn't jump onto the bandwagon with the Black Lives Matter movement as much as a lot of other countries did. Like Tunisia did. Tunisia is still protesting Black Lives Matter right now, and this whole George Floyd thing. But I think whatever reason, South Africa did not. But there is a lot of work in terms of the statues, and I agree. Like, it's not always just about removing it and then it solves, because it really doesn't solve the problem. Maybe even defacing it and leaving a defaced one on. One of the things, I was lucky enough to go to Mali in January, and it was the first time I left South Africa in the continent. Like, I haven't been anywhere in the continent, right? But I'm sitting here playing this music, and I'm collecting these records, and in a way it feels really weird to only know places through music. So what struck me so much about Mali was that there are monuments and statues of like Black liberation heroes all over the city. Like you have like Kwame Nkrumah like in the middle, you know, and I got so excited to see them. And I was like, why am I so excited to see something that's like static, like just a metal thing? But I think it's because of just it shows the bigger community's understanding of these figures and connection to them. Whereas in South Africa, we have like the biggest isolation from the continent. So I think that's the thing, is that because of the colonialism and apartheid, we have such a big disconnect to the continent. And that's also realizing that a lot more now. So I've been doing a lot of, in terms of writing and journalism, I've been doing a lot of articles recently that revisit apartheid. Well, and I say revisit because I think that, again, there was a lot missing from our education system, and only certain things were taught as opposed to what was left out. So I think looking at the effects that still exist today is really like what I've been doing. So I've been revisiting that through like politics, but also through music, and that has also like enabled me to realize how disconnected, like how South Africa was set apart, is really like a lot of times we are kind of like completely isolated in mind to the rest of the continent. There's no shared language. There's a lot of things that set us very, very like apart, you know, and keep us separated in mind and excluded. And then South Africans get this type of exceptionalism that things happen here to us and not anywhere else. You know, that's another thing about us that like it really annoys me is that like when I went to Mali, it's like South Africa is the America of the continent. Because people are sitting there watching soccer on DSTV. You know, there's like no paved roads or like, but nobody's, you know, life is peaceful. And I realize the arrogance that we have, even though we are suffering, there's a type of exceptionalism that comes with South Africans that everything bad happens and it only happens here. Look, it's just my opinion, but I really think that like there needs to be a big move of South Africa reaching out to the rest of the continent and reconnecting because you know, during the 60s there were a lot of connections in terms of like liberation struggles and also again back to the colonial mentality of people don't consider overseas. I mean, even if they travel, they don't travel through the continent, they travel through Europe or to America or whatever. It's just always this this thing of looking really like outwards. Record that I feel it's by an artist, a guitarist called Sir Victor Owefo from Nigeria. He's a guitarist, and it was given to me by a very good friend of mine who came back from some travels, and I was just starting my collection. She gave it to me. It's a double album that Soundwave was releasing, you know. So this thing of who releases the African records is another thing we can get to. But Soundwave was some of the first to reissue and do compilations of African music, also a lot of Latin music. And I guess it falls under 60s or 70s, and it's like Nigerian on the side of high life. But every song, it's a compilation, but every song on that album kind of is has a very joyous feeling to it, and also it seems to work in any situation. It seems to uplift.
Go to record.
Yeah, and I think the thing about it is that when you're playing music to people who don't know the music, it's when I feel like you're doing it right is when you're able to move them despite them not having any sense of familiarity to it. So there's something in the sound and there's something about the way you're doing it that really gets them to move. And but it's not always also just about dancing. It's also like the reaction you get when people are actually engaging with it and listening. So the Sir Victor Owefo album is really one that it has to come with. I have to take it with. It's just like yeah, it has to come with. And I think this is the other thing is like demystifying the notion. You know, when I started collecting, and I was surrounded by a lot of like heavy record DJs and selectors and collectors, and they always used to frown a little bit upon the compilation, you know, because you know, it's always about having the original thing. And of course I get that, you know, there's this hierarchy of nerdiness that happens. But the thing about African compilations is that often it's impossible to find those albums ever. Nobody even has them. So another one which I brought with, which I'll play later, is a Guinean compilation. And yeah, one of my favorite tracks, and it was like from just hearing it the first time, I was sitting outside and I was like, what is this? And what's funny is that it's by Bembea Jazz Orchestra, and the song is called Army Guinea. And it's about the Ghanaian army in the time of liberation. I just realized this like 2 days ago, that this is why the song is actually referenced, it comes up. But again, this feeling of absolute joy that comes from listening to it, even though not even understanding the lyrics, it's just about the like feel of the music. And I think, yeah, this is something I can talk about with Jambo, who was one of, you know, our mentors, and Jambo Donald van Drenen, aka Donald van Drenen, who was a massive figure in music, I think highly overlooked and underrated. And he would, when I think about his sets, is that he would string together from whether it was Latin or Cuban or African sounds, he would string together that like stayed on the level of joy and like happiness for like those 2 hours. It's something about the way he moved a room, like kind of captured that, and yeah, and I think he explored these types of sounds also. So it's I guess it's direct mentorship. because we all learning, right? And I think this is another thing coming back to the South African thing, is that like there's so much music in the continent, there is so much, and it is really like finding treasures. Learning about Ethiopian music was amazing for me. Learning about Somalian music, that was another like a very interesting find, or the discovery, if I have to say, use the word, but really just learning about the fact that a lot of old Indian music filtered into Somalia. So a lot of the music in Somalia in the 60s and 70s have the types of the singers. The voices are very high pitched, kind of like in Indian music, but it's actually from Somalia, but it's like you wouldn't even know that. And then there's also Orchestra Baobab from Senegal, that has like a massive, if you listen to it, you think you're listening to Cuban music, so that connection. And this was also like pre-internet time, the way that information spread was like very slow. So how did these sounds all happen at a time when information was not that instant? How did sound spread? And then there's also Moroccan Gnawa music, which I'm really into. Like when I started collecting, it was just to see the process of collecting. It has levels. So first it's like, this was pre-owning a record player and taking it very seriously. It was like, wow, what is this object? Why do I like it so much? I don't know. I can't even listen to the music, And then when you start taking it a bit more seriously, it's like, oh, like picking up things just based on the album cover, just based on a sound that you enjoy. It's not so serious. But once you start getting, and then it's like, oh, I need some soul, and I love dub, so I should try and find some dub, and like I really love reggae, and then you end up with these kind of different sections of your collection. But once, I think for me, I reached a level where I was like, if I'm gonna spend money on this stuff, and I'm gonna spend time looking and listening, then what I want to do is really focus on South African and African music, because there's so much. And because of the apartheid situation, any music that was considered good, or any black music really, a lot of black music was banned. Anything that referenced liberation was discarded or not played here. So during that time, so like, why when you go to Milnerton Market do you only find like Simon and Garfunkel and like Springbok radio hits? Why when you go digging in any other market in the world, you'll find stuff that fill in the black music world between the 60s and the 90s? But when you go to South Africa, you don't find that stuff. It's because these things were like scratched, they were gotten rid of, they were considered bad, they were considered very damaging. So that's why when you go into the shops, you don't find South African and African music. You don't find it, you barely find it, because it didn't filter down, it went out. So there's these people all over the world with these massive African collections. So I find more records in Paris, if I happen to be there for like one time in my life, than I will here, and it's shocking. So I think it's the importance when you start collecting seriously and you realize these things are expensive, they're also heavy, they're large, they take time, and they also sit if you don't listen to them, if you just keep collecting them and they're just sitting there. So it's like, what do I actually want to make an effort in learning about? And what it comes down to is like my main point, which is what we're also doing as a collective, which is like the records are the study material. So the colonial man like posting those lyrics, or even looking for those lyrics, is the study material, because I couldn't find it online. Like, does the current generation know that not everything is on Google and Wikipedia and everything? And when it comes to African and South African music, there's a lot that's not there. Because this is Huma Sekela, who's considered a mainstream figure. A lot of Miriam Makeba stuff is not on YouTube. So if we can't even get the sort of mainstream figures, how do you get the ones that are completely marginalized and sidelined? And with that kind of generosity, that's just like, we couldn't understand, because now we had found ourselves in like what seemed to be a scene, but there were very few of these type of mentor figures who were so generous with knowledge and kindness. You know, so when we would make a plan to go visit Jumbo and take him biscuits and whatever and have tea with him, and then when he leave, he'd say, "Don't you just want to take some CDs? I don't like, I'm digitized all of them, or I don't need the CDs." And we'd be like, "We don't. Okay, cool. Like, let's take some CDs. Just, and you know, listen to them in the car, whatever." But he was very, very, very generous and humble. I never heard him like he was always humble. Yeah. It's about making your intention to decolonize your mind, and that's what it is. Is to realize that the colonization happened in your mind and now results in your behavior, and now to decolonize is like using music and learning about the music. So that's why I've spent a lot of time thinking about writing about jazz from South Africa and how it came about, and who are the figures that were influential, and who are the figures that are still influential or still around. So with journalism, I mean, because I was kind of thrown into, like, no university experience can prepare you to write about music or dance or architecture or visual art. Like, you just do it. That's how you learn. You just do it. You know, in which case anyone can really do it. Right? But I think that what it did was to distinguish from the blogger voice is to really try and engage with things that I had no reference points. So when I moved to Cape Town, because I was also alone, I didn't have any friends here, I went to see everything from opera to ballet to as much as I could get from like dancehall, reggae vibes and hip hop vibes and spoken word and comedy and festivals, all these festivals all over Cape Town. Like, I went to everything because I really like had nothing else around me. I had no like life, I would say. Like, my life was to just engage with these things. So sometimes why it's cool to have been in Cape Town at a time, which I think now speaking to people was like maybe even a dying end. Like 2008 is not the most vibrant time of Cape Town music and culture. For me, it was so amazing compared to Joburg at the time. If I talk about venues and the fact that any night of the week you could go to something. Because we were in Joburg and we'd have to wait for the weekends, or we'd have to wait for a promoter to put on a great lineup, and we'd be so excited and we'd really support. But like in Cape Town, it was almost like sport for choice. You could have a spoken word night almost every night. There were hip hop nights, there were venues, there was safe nightlife, there was cutting edge electronic music. And they were just a dope community of people who enjoyed the sounds and like they were like heads, you know. And then also the theater scene, there was enough alternative and underground theater to balance this like Broadway mainstream theater thing. There was dance, there was so much in festivals. So I came here at a time when for me it felt very vibrant, and I've subsequently seen it, you know, draw out slowly and die, like, and come to a sudden halt through regulations and various things. But I think the essence is still here. But I guess what I wanted to say is that having been here at a time when there was so much happening and wanting to cover everything, you get forced into writing about everything. Until I finally came to a point where I realized that I was really drawn to jazz, and I was really drawn to the history of it, and I was really drawn to a lot of these young players who were playing this music. So there was a band called Babu with Christopher Naidu and Reza Kota and Shane Cooper and Ronan Skillen. And I always used to tell them subsequently is that, you know, I was always into this music, but you guys forced me into writing about it, because that started it really, even though it wasn't that long ago. And then there was Kyle Shepard, you know, I interviewed him. I was like 22 and Kyle was 21, and his like first album had come out, you know, and I remember being so nervous because, you know, I had so much respect for him. Shane Cooper became a friend of mine, you know, he still is, and Reza as well. And it's funny how there was at some point a scene of young jazz musicians really dominating Cape Town. There was like, and the Mahogany Room, which was a jazz venue, kind of contributed to that. So it all happened in a certain time. But now I think with journalism, I realized maybe it's like maturing, or just the shift from what is considered daily news to more feature type of writing. And I think with journalism now, the last three pieces, if I just look at my recent work, I think when you're forced into writing about things you have no real reference point about, that's just where the learning basically happens. You know, so you learn in the moment, and it's very difficult to write about music. Really, it's not an easy thing to do, but to describe sound and get it right. But I've been grateful for the opportunity to be pushed into it, as opposed to like science journalism or crime writing, or it's actually something I naturally gravitate to. Because even though I studied like this background, you can write about anything really, and also again with the nostalgia is this desire to write for newspapers, old school formats, print, a tangible thing that you can hold. And it gets difficult when the South African newspapers decide that the arts is like the least important part, and they start cutting out arts writers, arts editors, art sections, which is what's happened really. So that's where we stand. Is that I think when I moved here, there was a lot more alternative, even publications you could pick up for free. But now it's pretty much all online. Like you can't really get a physical print, regular, daily, weekly type of thing. So it's a little bit harder. People have to wait for the weekly papers or those kinds of things. And then on top of that, there's like a big lack in education with this stuff. Like how do you really write about arts? Like there's a bit of a gap there. So there's this journalist called Gwen Ansell who writes a lot about South African jazz, and she does a arts journalism workshop at the Jazz Festival. So that's something that also contributed to moving towards arts. In like 2009, I did the workshop, and then in 2010, I quit my job at the Argus because it was just going sideways. Like you always grow sideways in a corporation. You don't really go up unless, I don't know, you just don't. Or I didn't see it coming up like my way. So yeah, when I left, I applied to study in LA in a master's in specialized journalism. So that was to try and figure out like what is this thing called arts journalism? Like why don't I know much about it? Why it doesn't really exist in South Africa? Like so and what can I learn further from it? And I think when I came back, I was very wide-eyed and naive, and I was like, wow, I've got an education in an international university, in a good school or good institution. I'm gonna find a job easily. Until I realized that I was basically unemployable because I specialized too severely, or the fact that there just really aren't positions for arts journalists in paying positions in like the mainstream media basically. I've been unemployed since 2012, working gig to gig, freelance job to freelance job, and I'm still doing it. And a lot of people and mentors will say, that you should always keep it as your side gig. A lot of people have said you should have your main thing, which isn't fun, which keeps you going and pays the bills, and then you should do this as your side thing. But I've been so dedicated and challenging that notion and stubborn, but that often relies in like not having your rent money or really struggling sometimes. And then when things got pushed to online, so I think for many years I was really like I was just like, what am I supposed to do? This is what I'm trained in, this is what I love doing, this is what I know how to do. And artists would tell me all the time that there's a need for this work to be done. Like there's a responsibility to be the bridge between the artist and the community, like to be that kind of critical voice. So it felt like a responsibility. But I was really felt like I had no place really. I was just like, there's no point. It feels like hard work, but it's so undervalued, and tired of being the wrong color, the wrong shade, or the wrong sex, or whatever it is that goes into getting these positions, and who owns the media and all of that stuff. Then eventually I think I took a break from it and focused a lot on various other things like touring with this artist, which has resulted in some of these international trips, and future nostalgia and stuff. And now recently I've realized that I think it's something that I'm meant to do, like writing and engaging with the cultural community is something that I have to do. It's like really important for me. So I kind of came back a little bit recently after a long time of taking a break from writing. So under lockdown, I published 3 pieces, and that's what I want to talk about. Is there's like for me a new feeling that comes with it, And the first piece was an interview with jazz pianist called Nduzo Makatini, who's been the first South African artist to be released on Blue Note. But that really wasn't the focus of the piece. The focus of the piece was about his work as a sangoma and the spiritual connection in his sound and what he's putting out, like through the sound. And then I got an interview with Abdullah Ibrahim, which is always tricky, but there it was about his Japanese philosophy. So there was another spiritual connection there. And these are long form pieces of close to 2,000 words. You get to really go into it and really do something with what the person has said. And then this last piece has been about Youth Day, but not Youth Day as we know it, like Youth Day looking at those who passed away under police detention or under apartheid, that no justice was like kind of reached for, like, so kind of revisiting apartheid again. And then I did one for magazine which has just come out overseas now for July about jazz under apartheid. So looking at just tracing that story very quickly in terms of like the black struggle against music from the 20s. So that those pieces I've realized they're like research pieces. They go much beyond just like a daily type of quick instant thing. They're really like trying to fit the idea of research and writing together. So that's really what I'm interested in doing right now, and that's really what I'm going to focus on. And because this is what the blog voice has done, the blog voice has given you instant, unresearched, very limited developed work, and with you can't really rely on it, but blogs are everywhere. And so when you read something, you're like, this is the press release, or this tells me nothing new, or I learn nothing new. There's no voice in this, you know. So while there's a big gap in arts journalism education, and while there's a big gap in I mean like no space for the stuff to be out, you have to really like fight with people to get your work out. But the response with online, which I've had to shift my focus from newspapers, is that it reaches the world, as opposed to like a little newspaper in Cape Town. It reaches everyone. Once things go online, it changes your reach so much. And I think that's also like opening your mind to what it can do, because I think about the future. I think about someone looking for a piece like this 20 years from now, because they're trying to find out something about this moment, and then they found it, you know. So no, look, I think the thing is that when future nostalgia and stuff like that happened, aside from being the only woman in the group and all of these things, I'll talk about it a little bit just now. You become, and also DJing in front of a room full of people, like you go from being behind the scenes to being in front whether you like it or not. And I've always wanted to play music with a mask on or with a whole costume on, just so that I could just chill, you know. But I think that a lot of people kind of know me as a DJ or organizer of Future Nostalgia, and they don't know about the journalism part. And then they say, oh, like you do this thing also. And like, no, this is what I do. But I chose to put it away because it was too painful to deal with the reality of the fact that I chose a difficult thing to do, you know. So it's always feeling like you get like like everything becomes jaded. Like, what's the point of degrees? What's the point of 3 degrees with no work? What's the point of any of these things? Why do some get somewhere and some others don't? It leads to like crazy thoughts. So I think the point is to just pick yourself up and get back into it, even if it's difficult. And if you put something at rest, it's okay, because you can always come back to it and it'll still be there if it means something, you know. So but I think that I realized that I really like research. I really love the process of learning and verifying and like in counteracting. So this is a thing, going back to David Livingstone and the Scramble for Africa and this colonial stuff, is that like, you know, we're just listening to music, but also there's all these subtext happening, and it's also different perspectives, and you can use the music to learn about other stuff. And that's again where I think like it comes back to what Future Nostalgia is trying to do now, you know. It's like it's not just filling dance floors for now, especially at this moment. It's about like kind of learning together at the moment. Without being preachy also, because we also realize we don't know anything, you know, or everything, but anything really. So kind of to segue into what future nostalgia is, right? Um, it was started at the end of 2012 by myself and a few other like-minded individuals in Cape Town who just wanted to listen to music at somebody's house, and it was really like just sit together and listen to records. And because I was so obsessed with the medium, I was like, oh man, I would really like to be part of this vibe, just sitting in someone's lounge, which happened anyways. It was happening anyways. It's not like exclusive to anything. But because I worked at a jazz club at the time called the Mahogany Room, this was the break of journalism where I was doing the door and I was doing the media and social. I was the door person and I was doing their social media and their weekly newsletter that went out. I designed all of that with like basic WordPress and stuff. And I was just like, I'm not a journalist anymore. I'm doing this other thing. But anyway, so I was a bit lost, let's say. But it made me get to watch jazz every night for like 4 years by being at the door, 3 years or whatever. And also I knew the musicians already from working in Cape Town anyway, so it was like really easy. But then you get the like behind the scenes stuff and everything. But anyways, the owners at the time were a drummer called Kesiva Naidu and a trumpeter called Lee Thompson, and there was one other owner. And I approached them because I was working there anyways, and I was like, Tuesday's the only night there's no live music. What do you guys feel about having a music night here? You know, and they'd be like, they were just open to it. They said yes, they gave their blessing, and they gave their blessing without any charge, like any cost. It was just like, you know, go for it, do it, it's fine. And then when we were all sitting together and trying to figure out what to call this thing, Dylan Valley was one of the early members also, along with Butaji and a ton. Dylan said, Atiyyah, what about future nostalgia? And future nostalgia is like a concept that I told him about years ago. And I was, which basically was like, when you're in a moment that's so amazing that you can like foresee yourself in the future looking back at it. Because it came out of my time in Grahamstown and just like freedom and like just that kind of, I guess, growing up phase that was just so beautiful that I could feel myself looking back on it and thinking about it in a nostalgic way. So I was like, this is like future nostalgia because you can see yourself in the future looking back at yourself in the present moment. So I told Dylan about this, and anybody I met at the time, like anyone I just met, I'd be like, what do you guys think of this concept, future nostalgia? And like, I wouldn't say that it's to me, but it was for my experience in that time. And so when Dylan said, what about that? I was like, no, like you can't call the collective that. Like it's taking the personal into the public, and I don't think it works, you know. But there were tons of suggestions, and eventually everyone was like, no, it works. So that's pretty much how it stuck. And every Tuesday nights, every single week for Tuesday nights, we had what we call listening sessions, but it was 20 Rand at the door, and people came in. And the brief was that because there was no money, it was like, we're just coming to listen to music together. But it was at the jazz club where you could check out music all the time, which already had a listening policy, because when you watch their gigs, it was like silence. There was like no serving of alcohol in between. There was like a thing about being quiet. Like the venue was already set up as a listening space. But the point was to tell DJs or selectors or guests or whoever came that because we couldn't really pay them, it was like, listen, we're asking you to come, but please play what you would play to yourself when you're at your house, the type of stuff you think that nobody else wants to hear, or the type of thing you think you can't play in the dance floor. The thing that maybe more suited for chilled out vibe, but it can be dancing as well. It's just like play the thing that satisfies you the most. And in that way, we kind of worked around not paying people by not being able to, because it was a 20 Rand door fee, by basically making it full on about music appreciation. And years later, when things changed and the venue changed and everything, we even got to a point where we would buy the person who was the guest a record of their choice as an appreciation, because like they would choose and be like, here's something to add to your collection as a. But it wasn't really about the money from the start. It was done on a very DIY aesthetic, was done very much with the most basic, like use what you have to make something. And that is for me actually the African aesthetic, which is using what you can get at your disposal and thinking about it in a different way. From using books to create a record stand, taking fairy lights and stringing it everywhere just because the venue lighting was so dark, getting a rickety table and using boxes for crates for the turntables because we didn't have what's those things, flight cases, but you have to do it, and I think that was the thing, is that you can do it with not having anything. You build up the things that you need, but running events can be done on very small budget, if you really want to do it. And that's what was this. All we needed was the space. And the minute that the place closed down, it was first a weekly, then it went into the gig used to be a weekly, and I think that's how we got a following. And by maybe the fifth gig, we had D-Form as the first guest, and then it was just guest. Grant was also a guest. That's how we actually met. He played a guest set. We had trying to democratize, we can use that word, the process, meaning putting the DJ on the same floor as the crowd so that there's no separation between you of I'm here commanding you, because we weren't skilled DJs. So that was the thing, is that we weren't trying to be, and I also fought with that term quite a bit, that we have too much respect for people who are DJs and who've practiced the skill to actually even use that word. For me, I thought we were just all nerds listening to music, right? So we were, that term has always been uncomfortable for me, and it's also you can reach people. The other thing was putting out the record cover for display, because we really wanted that community vibe of coming up and being who is this? And for me, sitting through many sets or many nights where I didn't even play, I would just sit there by myself and just listen and go up every now and then and take notes and learn. So it was a learning experience. And then the thing with the guest, to get to the guest part, what was cool about that is that the point was, it's the tagline for Future Nostalgia has been for selectors, collectors, diggers, and DJs. And so what comes with that is that it wasn't limited to DJs, or it isn't. So this is how you make the circle a little bit bigger, because say for instance someone like Kent Lingerfeld, who was making longboards at Alpha Longboards, but Ken collected records. It was one of the goals for the collective, when everyone was together and it was strong at the start, was to create a publication, DIY zine publication that could be folded up and with interviews that I would have done with people about their collections, with images about the local Cape Town scene, with that kind of stuff, but also mixes from each guest that would go along with each scene. So I think there were lots of ideas about how to make it not just about the music and about the event itself. But so displaying the record covers, but having a guest profile. So that was one of the things, is that whenever we had a guest, they would normally not be a DJ from the scene. There'd be somebody who just collected, and we wanted them to come and show out the collection. So there were people who had never been in a gig before. Michael Batch, he played his first gig there. He was just a name on a list that nobody knew, and we were just let's get back, so that kind of thing of you're taking a big risk here, but just letting people come in who have never played gigs before and just doing what they want, Grant, who now co-runs Future Nostalgia with me, did the same. He was also first time at a gig, and a lot of other people. So it was a jumping off point. But from yourself, who always had amazing sets, Paul Waxon, who ran his own Waxon nights, Pierre from Vinyl Digs, Pierre and Jess, people like Jumbo, exactly. And one of the things I think that evolved, I think two highlights I would say, was that at some point, after some time, in going for 7 years, after some time, we realized that it kind of happened in a strange way, where someone approached us about putting on a gig with live music. It happened a few times. There were a few times where we were hosting live music, and each time was a very special experience of learning how do you go from doing a DJ gig where it's very minimal effort to putting on like hosting a band, and then you still have to pay the band, of course. You know, and you have to really make sure people buy tickets, and what that, like being pushed into the stress of that. So one of them, but it's been really cool stuff. We had Sikusile Taba, who we did an album launch at the waiting room, and then Shabaka and the Ancestors, who guested with Louis Moholo Moholo, which was also very special for us. So I think when and if we had the opportunity to do live gigs, it would be like this kind of one-offs, but it would make a lot of sense. On top of all of that, when there were no venues for us to play at, which has been the biggest problem since Mahogany or Straight No Chaser closed down, it's been like, say if there's a jazz gig happening in Guguletu, at Jazz at the Native Yards, and in the breaks between and after the jazz gigs, because it naturally works or worked, you know. But it's also about getting out of the city. But one of the main things I've been stubborn about being in the city of Cape Town is, it's funny because I'm not from here, but I'm from South Africa, and I do know how land and space works. And I think that I've been very stubborn about taking the gig to the community, which is important to me. It's very important to take the gig to the community, but it's also important to like reclaim space and hold down your own. And there's been about 4 years out of the 7 years, maybe 4 years, has been struggling with like white-owned club owners who just don't get the philosophy of what we do. We think it's all about making money at the bar, and it's been a struggle for space. But if we just give up and say, fine, we'll just do it somewhere else, away from the city, then it makes it easy. It makes it easy to populate the city with people who are a minority in the country, you know. So I think going to places where you're uncomfortable is very important, and it's something we need to like be more stubborn about. And infiltrating the spaces where the circles are too close are very important. And Cape Town is one of the most insulated, exclusive city that I've ever been to in my life, and I choose it to be home. So every time it's like, you don't want to be preachy and stuff, but like every time it's about how can you be more inclusive, who is being excluded from the conversation and why. And I think that's why I said like that's what future nostalgia is. That's what it continues to be. Now it lives in different forms. We have Grant who does the artwork, and we've started making zines as a way to extend the like self-publications and control over what you put out. And mixes, there's various other elements to it that it's beyond just like, yo, we're throwing a party, come. But I think that we always take the opportunity to mention when it needs to be about how exclusive the city and the music scene is. And so from my work as a music journalist, interviewing all these artists like my whole life, or like since I moved here, and then also working on the other side where you get the opportunity to be in those spaces, it's a very strange place to be because you know how both sides work, you know? And you also know the narratives of Cape Town that have completely been overlooked, underrepresented, misrepresented, all of that stuff.